we talk about just transition, right? We're about to mandate that we shut down these extraction facilities, extraction industries that have built entire towns and communities for decades.
Yeah.
And now we're coming in as a society and saying, nope, you're not allowed to do that anymore, as though it's like a drug deal happening that we're going to shut down and provide them no other jobs. I mean, wind and solar projects aren't going to be just to put in place of a coal mine, right?
It's not even close. You're from Rangeley.
Yeah.
I'm from Steamboat. We know Northwest Colorado. For anyone else listening, there are 2 coal plants in Northwest Colorado. One is in Craig. That coal plant and the mine and the revenue from the plant keep the entire town alive. The other is Hayden. Hayden power plant provides a lot of really high quality jobs for Hayden, and then it also provides a massive portion of the tax base to keep the schools open.
Yeah.
The Hayden power plant is a huge part of the community of Hayden. If we were to close those plants down without a viable way to replace that source of revenue and source of jobs for those communities, the communities are going to be devastated. And it's bad, right?
Generally cease to exist, as they exist now.
Oh yeah, they won't exist in any way the way they do now. They'll figure out what to do, but it behooves us as citizens of the state to try and help other parts of the community.
Right.
And for Craig, for Hayden, especially Craig, there's very little else there.
Yeah.
So ideally, we'd be able to build a nuclear plant there, because with the closure of the plant itself and the mine, there's going to be a lot of good labor. The coal plant workers who work at the coal power plant, they have the exact same skills that you need to work on a nuclear plant.
Just because the facts are A, if the narrative is B and everyone believes the narrative, then B is what matters. But it's our job in our industry to speak up proudly, soberly, and to engage people in this dialogue. Those 2.5 billion people that are in energy poverty, they need us.
America cannot meet this threat alone.
If there is a single country,
Of course, the world cannot meet it without America.
that is willing to
We're going to need you, the next generation, to finish the
overhaul
job.
nuclear regulation,
We need scientists to design new
and
fuels.
focus on net public
We need
benefit
engineers to invent new technologies. We
over absurd levels of radiation
need
protection,
entrepreneurs to sell those
then
technologies.
we will march towards this.
We need workers to operate assembly lines that hum with high-tech,
we
zero-carbon
have
components.
unlimited prosperity for all humans.
We need diplomats and businessmen and women and Peace Corps volunteers to help developing nations skip past the dirty phase of development and transition to sustainable sources of energy. In other words, we need you.
Welcome to another episode of the Fire Division podcast. I'm joined today by Kyle Frazer. We're here in person in the Xcel Energy offices here in Denver. Kyle's super excited to chat with you. Excited to be in person and do one of these face-to-face. So.
Yeah, me too. It's nice to actually see people instead of a little screen.
Right? Yeah. So we're going to chat across the table. And Kyle, for the audience, do you want to give a little bit of background on yourself, maybe 30 to 60 second intro about kind of who you are and what you do?
Yeah, so right now I'm the director of nuclear strategy for Xcel Energy. My background, I started in the nuclear Navy, operating a reactor on a submarine. Got out of the Navy, went back to school, the Global Energy Management program right here in Denver. While I was doing my master's program, Fukushima happened. And so that sort of changed my trajectory away from nuclear. And I didn't know what I was going to do, but I got into management consulting, did a lot of work in North America, went over to Europe, opened the European office, did some work in the North Sea for about a year. Then we did a chemical plant in Leeds, did some work in Norway, supported some analyses in the Middle East, Southeast Asia, then did a full analysis in Austria, and then a project in Paris. Moved back to the US in 2016, did a few more years of management consulting in the US, a little bit more in chemical plants, and then consumer packaged goods, so Coca-Cola, Victoria's Secret, basically a company that makes everything in your bathroom: toothpaste, soap, conditioner. Then I wanted to get off the road, so I started with Xcel in 2019, started in our internal management consulting team, and was supporting nuclear the entire time. And then officially in 2022, switched over full-time to nuclear to this position.
Nice. That's broad. We'll dive into a bunch of it. I can't wait.
Yeah.
We've met several times, and I've seen you speak on a panel before, so excited to learn about your background and kind of dive into some of the current issues. So we'll start kind of with the submarine, right? Being in the Navy. What was that like? What was it like being underwater? How long were you in? To give some background perspective on that.
Yeah, so I think about half the people in the country who work at nuclear plants came from the military, because that's our biggest pipeline for nuclear training. Yeah. Being on a submarine it's different. Obviously, this room is much larger than anything that we have on the boat.
It's probably like 20 feet by 10 feet in this room?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, our mess hall is probably similar, but the ceilings are a lot lower in where you eat on a fast attack submarine. But it takes a certain mindset. I think that a lot of people who run submarines get used to it very quickly, but then if you're not comfortable with that, it can be intimidating.
Yeah.
Everyone wants to know, were there windows on the submarine? No, it's a war vessel, so no, there are no windows.
It's designed to take hits.
Yeah,
right?
That's actually the most common question you get. So no, we do not have any windows on the boat. The longest we stayed underwater straight was 49 days during mission.
Wow.
The longest out of home port was 6 months. That's just a Westpac. That's pretty normal. I think every boat does about that. Sometimes they're longer. So yeah, 6 years. I got out as soon as I could. I'm very glad that I did my service. It benefited me a lot, but I was ready to get out.
Yeah. Well, we're thankful for your service. It's incredibly helpful. But I mean, everyone talks about SMRs and micro nuclear reactors. These things exist on submarines.
Absolutely.
They have for decades, for 50 years, right?
Yeah, the entire model of SMR is basically based on the idea of what we do on submarines. Every Los Angeles class fast attack has the same reactor. It's the same valve. It's the same setup. The entire thing is the exact same. So if you go from the USS La Jolla, which was my boat, to the USS Cheyenne, main steam, same system. In fact, the numbers of the valves are the exact same, so that you know exactly what you need to do. There will be some minor tweaks, but overall,
easy to change out parts.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the idea of the SMR. It's modular. It comes off of the assembly lines. There isn't just one valve in the entire world that's going to work. You have hundreds of valves because you have hundreds of submarines in the fleet, and they all require the same valves.
Yeah.
It's to the point where naval reactors can say, oh, we have had issues with main seawater 10. It has incursion, so we're going to change it to this type of valve, and then they'll just make the change in the entire fleet. This exact same idea will happen with SMRs, where you come up with one design, you build it all over the country, and then you have centralized warehousing. So if you need something, you can get it to where the SMR is located very rapidly. And if you come up with, hey, there is a design improvement, you can do it to the entire fleet.
Yeah. I was talking with a colleague about this recently. Are they predominantly PWRs or BWRs, or pressurized water or boiling water?
Yeah, so all submarines are pressurized water reactors.
Okay. Yeah.
And then there's fast attack is the old traditional type, the most basic pressurized water reactor you can think of. Whereas ballistic missiles or boomers, they actually have natural recirculation where you're not running the main coolant pumps, so you can actually make the boat even quieter for when they're on mission.
Got it. And everyone says that nuclear makes great base load because it's not optimal to load follow, but I think about submarines and they're essentially load following all the time.
Yeah.
Am I correct in thinking that, or?
You're spot on. So the difference between commercial nuclear and nuclear that you put on the submarine,
right?
It's wildly, the type of enrichment and the design of the core is very different. The commercial fleet in the U.S., it is optimized to just go up to power and stay there for 2 years, basically. Whereas a naval submarine, it'll go from 0 power to 100% power in a matter of minutes if need be. Well, not 0. You need to get it up and running, and then, 3 power to 100% power, you can do that in less than a minute pretty easily.
Yeah, that's awesome. Okay, so getting out of the Navy, I mean, you commented on it a little bit. It sounds like you traveled a lot. What were some of the most interesting things that you worked on before coming to Xcel?
Oh man, working in the North Sea was an interesting experience.
Was that for oil and gas in the North Sea?
Yeah, I was consulting for Talisman Sinopec, who is...
It's Norway, right?
No, it was actually Aberdeen.
Oh, okay.
Yep.
Yeah.
But going to a platform is a pretty unique experience. A lot of people would never imagine what you have to go through to do that. And having been in the military, it wasn't that big of a stretch, but you put on a suit that keeps out cold water, because if you fall into the North Sea, your chances of surviving are pretty low. And then you get on a helicopter, you fly out to the rig, you get on this little rig, and there are hundreds of people out there. It reminded me very much of being in the military, because you have a teeny little room. I had a lot more space on the rig than I ever did on the boat. But it was a unique experience, and you can bond with the other people that are out there on the rig very quickly, the same way you do on a boat, on a submarine, or probably on a carrier as well.
But being in that environment and being in a submarine gave you exposure to a lot of technology, a lot
Absolutely.
of experience. I mean, you get to see how all these tools are used, all these different energy systems, right?
Yeah, and that's so there are two parts. There's the cultural aspect that's really intriguing, because the North Sea that's where everyone wants to go if they're from a poor neighborhood in Scotland.
Yeah.
Because that's the people there are very well paid, and so there's an entire culture around going offshore that I had never experienced.
It's kind of like a rite of passage. Like it's competitive, right?
Absolutely.
It's one of the best paying jobs
very
you can have.
Yeah. And coming in as the American who I had to go through BOSIT, which is the training to go offshore, and a lot of people wait for years to get the money to then go to BOSIT to get training in the hopes that they can go offshore. And they're saying, I'm hoping that one day in the future I can do this. Whereas, I showed up and I said, I have to pass this training because I'm going off in 2 weeks. So, it's a completely different situation.
Yeah.
But then you go out and I was on Piper Bravo, which was made directly after the accident at Piper Alpha, which is probably one of the most famous disasters in off-sea or offshore production, right?
What happened? I'm not familiar with it.
So before anything in the Gulf and before, the BP accident in the North Sea, Piper Alpha had an explosion and killed hundreds of people. And the people who survived, a lot of them were stuck in the water for a long time, and some of them, even if they made it off the platform, died in the North Sea, which is just a terrible, terrible situation.
Yeah.
And that was because they had lax safety standards. There's a documentary called Fire in the Night, which gets into the exact cause and all the detail, and it's a very interesting story. But the Piper Bravo was the first platform that was built with all of the increased safety measures built right away. So the housing and where people live is a separate structure from the actual production floor. So you have your kitchen and your offices and where people get ready and where they live, and then there's a fireproof wall between that and the actual production floor. And then you have these massive well bores, and you drill it's offshore drilling, so it's pretty intense, but you also have the swells of the North Sea. It's cold. It's a very interesting environment.
I think that's a great example of how we designed a system. It was very dangerous. People died, but then we innovate, iterate, make it better on the next go around, right? So, yeah.
Like all engineering, right?
Yeah.
You can see this history in nuclear. We've made a lot of mistakes in the early days, and a lot of the really early nuclear innovation led to some pretty bad results. A lot of this stuff was all DoD stuff, so it's not public information, but going through nuclear power school in South Carolina, we learned about a lot of it. And then if you go to Idaho National Labs and you can go and work at the labs themselves, you can go out and see where, this reactor, we were going to try and put it in a plane. One of the nuclear instruments had an unrecognized saturation characteristic, and so the reactor thought power was going down, and in fact it was going up, and it just melted the core and shot core material out into the desert in Idaho. And so it's an interesting history.
Yeah, I love reading about all that stuff.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's fantastic. So, I mean, what led you to Xcel? I mean, you said you started in 2019. What got you interested in joining?
So, management consulting, at least the consulting I was doing, was 100% on the road. So I would be,
Okay.
I would leave Sunday night, come back Thursday night or Friday morning, and my wife said, "Hey, if we want to continue to have a relationship, I need to see you more often than 2 days a week, right?"
Yeah.
And so I started looking for opportunities that would keep me in Denver, and Xcel happened to have just finished its first round of, we call it XE1. That's what my shirt says. It's the Xcel Energy One Way.
Okay.
And that was, we hired McKinsey on one of the floors above us to come in and help with productivity improvements and just trying to help us cut costs and improve performance. And our CFO at the time, who's now our CEO, he said, "Hey, why are we paying all this money to McKinsey when we could just build our own team internally to do it?" And so
Gotcha.
the gentleman who hired me at the time was building that team, and they hired me to do exactly that. So we had about a 6-month turnover while we still had McKinsey in-house doing some of the work, and then we slowly eliminated the McKinsey support and did a lot of the work internally.
Okay.
And
You weren't working for McKinsey as the consulting firm, right? But
No.
you found Xcel job. They had an opening here, and
Yeah.
part of it was building that team. And then,
Yeah, and I had worked with McKinsey when I was in Europe. So
Okay.
they were doing a reorg at Talisman Sinopec when I was in the North Sea, and so I knew, I'd done that work before. I
Right.
worked with them. I knew all the methodology. Everything was, it's fairly easy once you've done it a few times with different organizations. So it was easy to sort of say, hey, we can do all this internally, build the right team.
Yeah, that makes sense. So about 6 months turnover, and I mean, I think everyone should know who Xcel is, but maybe if there's international guests, just kind of
Yeah.
maybe give an overview of the utility.
Yeah.
What,
So
what are you guys? What do you do? Where are your service areas?
Yeah, Xcel Energy, we're an investor-owned utility. We operate in 8 states: Texas, New Mexico, Colorado, North and South Dakota, Minnesota, Michigan, and Wisconsin, right? And that's Xcel formed when multiple utilities that existed before were joined together under Xcel. So Piesco, Public Services Company, Colorado, that's our Colorado branch that
Right.
turned into Xcel.
Subsidiary that, yeah.
Yep. We operate 2 nuclear sites in Minnesota. There's Monticello and Prairie Island. So Monty is a boiling water reactor, about 600 megawatts, and it is northwest of Minneapolis. Prairie Island, it's actually 2 pressurized water reactors right outside of Red Wing, which is southeast of Minneapolis.
Gotcha.
They're both on the Mississippi River.
Okay. So large service area. Is each, I'll ask this out of curiosity or ignorance, is each state function independently and you have to get plans approved in each state?
Sort
Or
of.
have generation capacity?
We have, it's not, well, Colorado is by state, but Texas and New Mexico, they both or operate under the same group, SPS. And so we do the same with Minnesota, North and South Dakota. That's Northern States Power Minnesota, NSPM. And then Wisconsin and Michigan are NSPW for Northern States Power Wisconsin.
Yeah.
So it's 4 operating companies together under Xcel Energy.
Gotcha. Okay, well, we're in Colorado, so let's zoom in on Colorado.
Yep.
There's a lot of policy right now being discussed and tried to be implemented about, the state's trying to be 80% carbon free by 2030 and 100% carbon free by, 2040, 2050 time frame, sometime after 2030.
So you're conflating 2 different goals here.
Yeah.
So Xcel, as a corporate entity, has a stated goal. We were the first utility
That's right.
to announce
Yes.
80 by 30, so 80% carbon free by 2030. And then the second part of that is 100% carbon free by 2050.
Right.
Now,
Those are Xcel's objectives.
that's Xcel's
Right.
objectives, right?
Yep.
And we're going to figure out how to do that in our service territories.
Right.
However, since we announced those goals, the state of Minnesota has said, hey, we're going to be 100% free by 2040. So their goal is even more aggressive than our original goal, and we're going to have to figure out how to actually meet that goal. There is a similar effort in Colorado. New Mexico has a similar effort, but they're approaching it a different way by saying there will be no new carbon-emitting generation installed in the state from now on. And they
In New
implemented
Mexico?
that. Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
So,
it's confusing.
well, there are some off-ramps based on price. So
Okay.
if the price is well outside of the range of reason, then they're going to allow carbon. But this was an incentive to try and build
Yeah.
carbon-free power
Got it.
generation.
Okay. So Xcel has those goals.
Yeah.
Can you speak to Colorado's, or how they mesh with kind of Colorado's policies?
Absolutely. So Colorado recently has taken more of a aggressive approach trying to reduce carbon emissions. There is a little bit of, I don't want to say conflict, but there are, a lot of Colorado is oil and gas friendly, specifically
Sure.
northern area around Greeley, Weld County, down south
It's
around
the
Trinidad.
sixth largest oil producing state in the nation. right?
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
lots of oil coming out of there.
And then on the western slope, obviously around Rifle, there's
Yep.
and historically Colorado has had a lot of oil and gas production as well as coal. I mean, we've been an energy center for a long time, but with a lot of people want to move to Colorado to enjoy the mountains and enjoy the forests, but with climate change, we're seeing that we're having a negative impact on the environment by having the carbon emissions. So a lot of people are trying to increase our reliance on carbon-free generation.
Yeah.
Now, where that ties into nuclear is that Colorado had a nuclear plant, Fort St. Vrain.
Yep.
It was a helium-cooled reactor. They burned thorium in the core as well as uranium. It shut down because it did not operate well, and the cost was going to be very high to make the required repairs. There are a variety of reasons.
But that was a
for that.
commercial utility scale plant, or was
It
that?
was.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was operated by Public Service Company Colorado on the mighty Fort St. Vrain River, just north of Denver. We converted it over to a coal plant, so it's still operating as a energy center. It's not coal anymore. Now there's natural gas facilities there. But you can still go and actually tour the visitor center at Fort St. Vrain.
There's a group of us actually going to go at the end of the month and tour it.
Yeah.
So we're
Is
excited
that
with that.
with Doug?
Yeah.
Yeah. I'll be there.
Excellent. Can't
Yeah.
wait. Yeah.
So when we look at generation, right now Xcel has 4 coal plants operating in Colorado. In 2020, state of Colorado said you need to figure out how to, this was through an EPA ruling, clean air. We need to shut down all of the coal plants by 2030. We need to come up with a plan to do that. So right now, Xcel's planning to shut down all of our coal plants by end of 2030. The only one that's going to make it into the 2030s is Comanche 3 down in Pueblo, and it'll be closed by the end of 2030. So January 1, 2031, there will be no coal operating in Colorado that's owned by Xcel.
That's fascinating to me.
And it's fascinating to a lot of people
Yeah.
because it's firm, dispatchable, base
Right.
load. It can be relatively inexpensive, and so that is the conundrum
Yeah.
because we're trying to replace it with wind and solar, and wind and solar, as you know, are intermittent sources. So in Colorado, especially on the plains on the east side of the state, we have a lot of wind in the middle of the night, but it's not consistent.
Yeah.
And if you have a heat dome in the summer, you may have multiple days with no wind whatsoever. In February this year, 2023, we went from a very windy day to basically no wind in a matter of hours. And that knocked a huge amount of generation off of the grid. And luckily we were prepared. We were able to ramp up and cover the generation decline of the wind with natural gas and coal. But if we close down all of our coal plants, we will not have that ability in the same way that we have in the past.
Do you know off the cuff what % of generation the coal plants are? Are they like 10%, 20%?
I believe they're closer to 50%. I don't know the specific numbers. I have them at my desk
Yeah,
somewhere.
we can look them up and we'll put it in the show notes. Yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty significant.
Yeah.
Especially because you have, so Craig Station, that's 3 actual coal plants. It's one site, but there are 3 plants.
Right. 3 generators that are
Yeah. They're probably
500
between 600 and 1,200 megawatts each. I don't know the specifics.
Yeah.
And then Hayden is 2 coal plants, and I think they're around 500 each, so it's around 1,000 megawatts. And then we have Pawnee out in Brush, and it's a coal plant that we're going to be switching over to natural gas. And then Comanche, which is Comanche 1, 2, and 3. Comanche 1 and 2 are both relatively small, but Comanche 3 is a big unit. Right? So it's gigawatts of power that we're going to be taking off the grid.
Yeah. So what's the current strategy for that?
Right now we're planning on replacing as much as we can with wind and solar, and hoping that battery technology improves over the near future to the point where it becomes cost competitive and we can build some sort of long-term storage. So that would be, right now the idea is batteries. Do you know what Cabin Creek is?
No.
So Cabin Creek is a pump storage unit, which is up near the top of Guanella Pass.
Okay.
So during the middle of the night, when there's a lot of extra wind, we can pump water from the lower reservoir up to the upper reservoir. And then when there's high load, we drain water from the upper reservoir to the lower, or we drain it, and the sluice goes right next to a turbine, so you're actually spinning a turbine with the water from the upper reservoir into the lower reservoir. So it's basically a huge battery.
Right.
There are a lot of pumped hydro projects that are in consideration around the world. They are extraordinarily expensive. Environmentally,
Yeah,
they
it's very
can
expensive
be,
storage. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
they can be devastating environmentally because you're creating a reservoir, and to make them big enough to have significant storage, you can make absolutely massive reservoirs.
Yeah.
So that one is an idea that people are pursuing. We floated that idea internally. The cost was just way too high. So we're not, as of right now, planning on any more pump storage in the U.S. There's a lot in Norway.
Yeah.
Because they have a lot of excess energy, and with hydro.
And a lot of elevation gain, that right?
Absolutely.
Canyons and
Yeah.
optimal. Yeah.
Yep. Fjords with lakes and lots of different terrain changes over very short distances. So it's optimal, like
Yeah.
ideally suited for that sort of energy storage.
Colorado, even though we have lots of mountains, the landscape is different, and we've
Yeah.
built a lot of reservoirs already in kind of the best spots to build them throughout the state.
Yeah, and then your problem is that you do not have a ideally located reservoir that is relatively close to another ideally located reservoir
Right.
with a connection between the two. I mean, it's a absolutely massive cost to build the infrastructure to make that realistic.
Right. They have these huge transport canals or pipelines that you got to pump the water back up.
Yeah. Australia is in the middle of building one of these things that is, the cost is in the billions, and they're dramatically behind schedule on the project.
Yeah.
I would encourage you to look it up if you have the time. It's interesting. But so that's one battery option. We're looking into a lot of advanced battery technologies. I mean, most of the batteries that exist right now are just regular lithium-ion batteries. On the way out to DIA, people have seen the huge Panasonic building. That's actually a demonstration battery to figure out, hey, is this thing
How long is it going to
viable?
last? What's it work? What's the actual,
Yeah.
the real capacity factor, the real lifetime?
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. So that was sort of a prototype, a pilot project to see how batteries would integrate into the grid, what is the value they add, and they do have a value. There's no doubt. The problem is you'd have to have an absolute massive build out of batteries to truly make up for your reduction in other firm dispatchable. So if
Yeah.
you get rid of all of your coal plants, that's gigawatts of generation that's coming off the grid. You then have to replace that with gigawatts worth of storage capacity. And then you have to have the means by which to charge that storage capacity. So if you were to build a 500 megawatt wind plant, one, the capacity factor's probably around 20%. I mean, we've seen 17%. There are some that are low 20s.
Is that typical in Colorado then? Because I hear wind is often 30 to 40% capacity factor, and there's some offshore projects that tout above 50% or even close to 70%. But you know,
I don't think there's anywhere in Colorado that's going to be over, especially right now. I mean, we've already built in a lot of the really great places.
Yeah.
So now,
so additional wind capacity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And of course, once you get to a threshold, every next location you build on is going to be worse than the one before.
Yeah.
So we're to the point where we're starting to see diminishing returns for our wind generation facilities, in Colorado at least.
Right.
Now, if you go to the Dakotas where it is more consistent wind, less concern about population impact because there's a lot of just open land, you might be able to get higher capacity factors.
Right.
But back to the point, you need to massively overbuild out your renewable capacity to then charge the batteries as well as maintain the grid. So hypothetically, we'd say we only need 5 gigawatts of power in Colorado. So we could build 5 gigawatts worth of generation. But with wind, because it has low capacity factor, you have to build significantly more nameplate to cover your load. And then if we have firm dispatchable that is in the form of battery, you then have to charge that battery as well. So you have to build more wind to charge the battery to help maintain the grid when there is no wind.
Yeah.
And same with solar. So during the day, you have lots of extra power.
I mean, back of the envelope, solar is pretty simple. I mean, if it was sunny every single day and you had a 40 to 50% capacity factor, you'd have to build at least 2x solar, right, to charge at night.
Yes.
I mean, pretty simple to think about that.
Yeah.
And then have enough battery capacity to last through the night.
Yeah.
I mean, that's like the bare minimum, but of course
Yeah.
we know it's not, and so it's the inverse of...
And that's in an ideal world, right?
Yeah.
Assuming, it's summer and you get lots of sun, and the solar panels are not covered with snow or dust, or you're not having a cloudy day. That's what's interesting about solar facilities. We have some graphs that sort of show, you have your days and nights,
Right.
but then if a big cloud rolls in front, you'll be up at the top of your peak, boom, straight down to almost nothing. And then the cloud goes back, boom, back up to where it was. And that, in maintaining a grid, is really hard to account for.
Yeah.
So hypothetically, you'd be able to have a battery that would help
Even out some
reduce
of that load.
that. Yeah, I'd say, okay, this battery can pick up this dramatic drop, but cycling batteries too often is bad for the batteries.
Yeah.
And we might get to the point where some of our batteries are better, but right now we're still struggling with rapid change in discharge rate or charge rate or whatever it is.
So I think these ideas can be summarized succinctly, right? Everyone says renewables are very cheap, levelized cost of electricity is very low, but that's not taking into the consideration the system-wide cost, right? So
Right.
levelized systems cost of electricity, right? Or
Yeah.
is there a better acronym for that?
I don't know if there is a...
There should be, right? We should have one,
yeah. and that's... On Tuesday, we were talking about the transmission part of what our grid will look like in the future, because
Yeah.
there is a lot of wind in the Dakotas where there's not a lot of population. Wyoming has a lot of wind and not a lot of people. So we could, in some idealized future, have windmills all over the state, and we would have
Sufficient
optimal
generation
design.
capacity to be able to provide
Absolutely.
this, but
But we'd have to get that power to the population centers. And it's a
Yeah.
long way from North Dakota to California. And transmission losses are built in. You have competition for those transmission lines from other sources of generation. The grid is a very complex system. And the amount of investment involved to get a grid capable of moving generation from the center of the country to the coasts or to where the load is very, very, very expensive.
Well, and I think a huge piece of that cost is the land use. I mean,
Absolutely.
just getting access and permission to build these lines and getting right of way to do it costs a lot of money, and there's a lot of people that don't want them.
Right. There's NIMBY.
I think that's on. I don't think we talk about that often enough.
No.
Transmission NIMBYism, or NIMBYism for not in my backyard against transmission lines is a huge problem.
Yeah, I would say in the Dakotas, where it's relatively flat and it should be fairly easy to build transmission lines, the majority of your cost is going to be acquiring the land to build the corridor.
Right.
Whereas in Colorado, going over the mountains, you're probably going to have a lot more cost associated with building transmission over the Continental Divide and through the mountains to get where it needs to go. But everywhere, it's expensive. Now, if you want to say, hey, we're going to just claim eminent domain and take away farmers' land to build transmission, I mean, that's possible. But I don't think
that's
that
nationalizing the energy system, though.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah, you run into issues no matter what you do, and the amount of cost that's going to be required is probably more than people are comfortable with right now.
Yeah. Okay, so Xcel has this goal: 80% carbon-free by 2030. You know, your plan for batteries, or you're hoping the batteries are going to get better to provide this backup generation and storage ability during the troughs of intermittent power sources, but hope is not a plan. Or it's never a very good plan, right? And so
Right.
I'm sure you guys are looking at other options. What else could be built or could be done that's not coming from these intermittent sources?
The majority of our other work is in either hydrogen, which hydrogen can act as a battery,
Mm-hmm.
or in geothermal, and we're looking into biogas. We're looking into all sorts of different options, but
Yeah.
probably our biggest effort is in hydrogen.
Okay.
So the interesting part about hydrogen is that as the electrification of our homes as well as the grid occurs, so right now most Coloradans use natural gas for heating in their homes. Their furnace is natural gas powered. One of our goals is to require more electrification, or figuring out a way to not use natural gas in the traditional natural gas sense. Maybe it's biogas, maybe it's hydrogen that you can burn in your furnace instead of natural gas. That's going to significantly increase the requirement for hydrogen. So in that use, you're directly burning hydrogen as a replacement for natural gas in heating for homes. The other side is you can burn hydrogen in some of our natural gas turbines. So we have combined cycle, simple cycle turbines that burn natural gas. They're the other form of fossil fuel generation on our grid. Most of the turbines that we have can burn some
Percentage.
low mix of hydrogen, but right now I don't think we have any turbines on our system that could burn 80% hydrogen. I mean, I don't think they can even go to 50% without significant modifications.
Yeah.
Furthermore, hydrogen is a very slippery molecule, and hydrogen will brittle steel. It will have impact on different metals that we don't fully understand in a system that was built, in some cases, hundreds of years ago. I don't think there's much left that's that old, but Denver, we have our Denver steam plant. Denver steam provides a lot of heating for a lot of the buildings in downtown Denver. That's a very old system, and it still works, but it's very costly. If we were to replace that with electrification, if we were to heat all the buildings with electricity, well, then you're increasing your electrical demand.
Yeah.
So there's going to have to be a way to balance our generation demand and the increase due to electrification, and figuring out what to do with the hydrogen, because it can't go only for heating, it also has to go for generation.
Yeah. And I always think it's important to highlight hydrogen isn't an energy source, just an energy carrier.
Right.
It's essentially a battery.
Yeah.
Or it serves the same purpose as battery.
Yeah, and in the, well, if we're burning it directly in the homes, then it's actually an energy source. If we're
You have to source the hydrogen from somewhere.
Yes,
right?
yeah. So hypothetically, if we have a bunch of wind
Yeah.
in the middle of the night, so let's say in the middle of the night is usually when we have the lowest load. So, and these are made up numbers. In the middle of the night, we're only using 1 gigawatt of power in the state, and we have 5 gigawatts of generation. You could take 4 gigawatts of generation and turn that into hydrogen production.
Right.
Wild amounts of electrolysis. You're going to have a lot of losses in the electrolysis itself, but you could end up with 2 or 3 gigawatts worth of hydrogen that you're producing overnight that you could then deploy during the day.
Right.
So in that case, it is acting as a battery because you're creating it and then you're going to use it at a later time.
Right. But you had to have the excess generation built and have it available when it's not being used. And that, when I've studied this, the round trip efficiency of hydrogen is often like
It's pretty low.
sub 50%, sometimes down to 10 or 20%, meaning like
Yeah.
for every unit of energy you put in, by the time you finally burn the hydrogen or turn it back into something useful, you're only using some small fraction of what energy you actually originally put in.
Yeah. Depending on hundreds of factors, it can be very low. I
Yeah.
mean, ideally, we would be able to get it up so it was significantly higher, but you already called it out. You get back to the base case that it's just a battery, and you have to significantly overbuild your generation capacity to charge that battery. Whereas if you had firm dispatchable base load, you'd say, okay, well, I don't have to wildly overbuild to charge the battery because I've got the base load already. So right now, today, we have the base load in the form of coal and natural gas. Most of our natural gas acts as peaking units to help cover the gap when we don't have renewables, but our coal very frequently is a base load. And that's where, obviously, nuclear can come in. So nuclear is a spectacular base load. Most of the reactors that are currently operating, that's all they are. They're just base load.
Yeah.
Some people are evaluating turning nuclear into a little bit of a flex unit by using nuclear plants to do the electrolysis to create hydrogen
Right.
when there happens to be a renewable. But at that point, electrons are electrons. So if you have extra capacity from your wind and you have your nuclear, you still have extra capacity somewhere. It doesn't matter if it's from the wind or the nuclear. So
Yeah.
it just happens to be convenient to site it at the nuclear plant because you already have people, you have infrastructure, you have what you need
Well, and you could
existing already.
I think there's some thermodynamic advantages to if you're using high temperature systems.
If you do high temperature steam
Right.
for the electrolysis, yeah, there is built-in efficiency that way.
Yeah. The wind couldn't necessarily supply, right? Because,
Right.
I mean, the electrolysis wouldn't be as efficient
No.
as that.
Yeah, if you do electrolysis from low temperature water, you have to add in more energy to get out the same amount of hydrogen. Whereas if you have high temperature water or steam, you can do the electrolysis with lower energy input.
Right.
Because a lot of your energy is coming from the temperature, which is just the steam.
So from that perspective, the calculus could be more beneficial for a thermal plant that is carbon free, like nuclear
Absolutely.
plants.
Yeah, and that's Xcel happens to be. We are building a pilot for high temperature electrolysis. I believe we're one of the only plants that's doing actual pilot work on that right now at scale
Where's that?
in Minneapolis, on
Oh,
Prairie
nice.
Island. Yeah.
Okay. Cool. Well, we kind of beat around the bush. We covered a bunch of the other energy generation sources to get there, right? But this is a generally nuclear podcast. So
Yeah.
what's Xcel's view on nuclear? I mean, it seems like it has a lot of the advantages for being a replacement for some of these carbon sources that are shutting down, but how does it fit into your guys' calculus?
And I can't speak for Xcel on this. I can tell you my opinion.
Sure. Yeah.
So we're going to need more firm dispatchable power in the future. I think everyone sees the writing on the wall as we get closer to this date. We're not where we need to be in terms of having a really solid plan. I mean, we are still hoping the batteries are going to get better to the point where they can help us solve this gap. But I, like you, don't think hope is a reasonable plan. I think that we need to actually increase our use of nuclear. And I don't think that there's anyone who has a good understanding of how the grid works that thinks we can do this without nuclear.
Yeah.
a lot of other utilities are including nuclear in their resource plans, and they're including significant additions of nuclear to make sure that they can meet the demands of the future. We talked about electrification earlier. Another big part of that is EVs. If we significantly increase the amount of EVs that are driven and used, then we're going to have to come up with generation to charge those EVs. Right now, there is a gap between where we are and where we need to be in terms of powering those EVs.
Yeah.
Now, if we
Meaning
were
just
really
generation capacity.
good, straight up
yeah.
nameplate generation capacity.
We don't have enough to meet EV goals that
Right.
our policymakers are setting.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Whereas we know that if we had more baseload generation, that would be a little bit more achievable.
Yeah. Interesting. So, do you think Xcel would ever consider building a nuclear power plant in Colorado?
I would like to think so. That's a big part of my job. So
You're like, yeah, I'm currently being paid to scope it and
Yes.
figure it out. Yeah.
yeah. Obviously, there's risk. As an investor-owned utility, we are very risk-averse. Investors enjoy utility shares and utility stock because they are
It's stable.
steady.
Yeah.
They're going to stay in this band, almost never go outside of that band. If they go outside of that band, that's a problem for a different conversation. But that means that we're very risk averse. And nuclear, based upon the last decade or two in the United States, is risky no matter what.
Yeah.
Look at Vogtle. I mean, that's about the worst case scenario for a utility executive.
Yeah. I think summer might have been worse for the guys went to jail for that one.
Yes, yeah. So that's true, but it's something that was actually built.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So yeah, summer, absolutely a huge problem. On the other side, if you go to France, they've been building nuclear for a long time, and a massive amount of their long-term plan is going to continue to rely on the existing nuclear plants. So they were at times 85% nuclear generation for their electricity. That is amazing.
Yeah.
So we know that it's possible. And granted, they do have higher electricity costs than we do, but they also have other systemic differences in their system, which some of them would say, okay, now you can see why they're going to have a higher cost because they just have a completely different sort of system.
Right.
Others would say, hey, a big part of the increased cost is that they're majority nuclear. But in fact, they are providing electricity for other countries at a lower cost than those countries can do coal in their own country. So
Yeah.
it's a much more complex problem than I think a lot of people really appreciate.
So let's highlight some of the risks and kind of take them head on. And what are they, and how could they get worse, and how could they get better, or how could they become mitigated, or how could they be spiraled out of control? And the two that I want to focus on are cost and regulatory.
All right, so you're skipping the biggest risk, which is the risk of meltdown, right? A nuclear accident.
I generally don't view that as a risk.
And
meaning
you
there's
You shouldn't
great
with
data
modern
that
technology.
demonstrates for decades, for half a century, we've operated these things and we've killed almost nobody.
Right.
Right. So
Yeah, I mean,
that's not a risk in my mind.
and it shouldn't be, but it is. And that is part of the problem, because it's not a true risk, but it's perceived
It's a
as
perceived risk. Perception is
the
90%,
biggest risk.
9 reality. Yeah.
Right. So, China syndrome, Chernobyl, any movie where there's a nuclear disaster, all that does is increase the perceived risk of a nuclear accident. So in the United States, in commercial power, we've been very lucky. We have not had any serious meltdowns outside of 3 Mile Island, and that was a serious meltdown. That was also not as bad as it could have been. No one got extra radiation. No one outside of the actual power plant itself got any radiation beyond what you just get from living your normal life.
Right.
So that was blown out of proportion from a public safety standpoint, but it still captured the imagination of people due to the unfortunate release of the China syndrome, the movie with Jane Fonda where a reactor melts through the center of the Earth to China.
Well, that's really part of this podcast effort, is to change the perception, right? Change the hearts and minds of the people that we care about, that we want to build power for, and let's help alleviate some of those fears. So.
Yeah, and I think not only have we proven in the United States that we can operate reactors safely, but with the advances in technology, it almost becomes a non-issue because most of the, so let's talk about the three big accidents that everyone knows. 3 Mile Island, that was basically a Gen 1 reactor. It was a Gen 1 reactor. I mean, this was the very start of nuclear power.
Yeah.
A lot of the naval nuclear design took the lessons learned and then applied it to advanced reactors in the Navy. And they're not even advanced reactors in the way we say advanced nowadays. They were just slight improvements on the Seawolf, right? The next one after that was Chernobyl. Now, Chernobyl was a serious, terrible accident. A lot of people died. No operators died, but the core was open. First responders died from acute radiation sickness.
Right.
People who were flying directly over the core in helicopters were getting ridiculous doses.
Yeah. I do think it's important to qualify when you say a lot. When I've looked at the numbers, it's about 50 to 200 would be a reasonable estimate for first responders.
Oh yeah.
You know,
Oh yeah.
as far as total people, and then the excess cancers and excess deaths.
Well,
It's
that's hard to
still
really quantify.
Kind of
so
500 to 1,000 maybe. Like
I would say less than that.
you would say less. Yeah.
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 The
I was being generous, right? Yeah.
Right. No, that makes sense. The first responders, it was less than 100 people.
Yeah.
We know by name about 36 people who died from acute radiation poisoning within the first 24 hours.
Yeah.
There are other people who died shortly thereafter, most likely due to a radiation exposure. Beyond that, it's almost impossible to tell.
Yeah.
Did the released radiation expose a lot of people? Absolutely. But was that radiation exposure enough to significantly increase the risk of cancer? Probably not.
Yeah.
Chernobyl right now is actually thriving because people have stayed
Like
away from it.
the biodiversity is phenomenal.
Yeah.
Looking at some of the,
we haven't destroyed the forest. We haven't gone in and hurt the animals. I mean, the wolf population is one of the strongest in the world. So
yeah.
obviously the long-term effects of that, as terrible as it was, are not as bad as a lot of people like to think.
Right. Well, just to put in perspective, maybe a couple hundred people died from the world's worst nuclear power accident versus the offshore platform accident that you referenced earlier in our conversation. Several hundred people died.
Yeah.
And I'm sure if you normalized on units of energy generated, like one is significantly worse than the other. Meaning Chernobyl, even with all the deaths, produced way more energy, and energy per deaths is much, much higher.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. No, and that's an interesting. If you go all the way down that rabbit hole, and you say,
which I have many times, it's
if we look at all of the power production on Earth, and then we say, let's look at the entire chain. So we're going to go mining of coal, mining of uranium, mining of silicon to make, probably not mining, but creation of silicon for solar panels. And you say, we're going to compare the number of deaths compared to the power output. Nuclear is by far the safest. By far. So, the amount of people who die in coal mines every year is absolutely mind-blowing. Because it's, especially outside of the United States. We have miners die in the U.S. every single year.
Yeah.
I would challenge you to find how many uranium miners have died in the U.S. in the last 50 years.
Yeah. Probably very few. I don't want to say zero, but I can almost guarantee very few.
I think the answer is zero.
Yeah.
I've never heard of a single one, and I've looked into it.
Yeah.
Now, whether or not, if you go to Russia, where a lot of the uranium is being mined right now, I don't know the conditions of the mines in Russia, but I would imagine that they're not good.
Yeah.
I also think that the amount of power you're going to get from the uranium that you mine is still significantly higher than the amount that you would get from the coal mine.
Oh yeah, 100%.
With significantly lower deaths.
Yeah.
So,
okay, so that's the first risk, or risk of meltdown, but really it's a
hold
perceived
on.
risk.
So now we have to go back to Fukushima.
Okay.
So that's the third big
That's
accident.
right. Yeah. We're walking through each of these.
Yeah. So Fukushima was a Gen 2 reactor. It was a good design. Still is a good design. It was designed with a massive earthquake in mind. Or it was designed with a massive tsunami. It didn't account for both. And in fact, the earthquake that they had was the largest they'd ever had. So they were not expecting the largest earthquake in the history of the island with modern technology to actually determine that it was the largest, and an absolutely massive tsunami at the same time. Even with both of those, the plant shut down. It was relatively safe for a few days. The problem was they couldn't get diesels flown in, and the tsunami swamped the diesels that they had on site. It swamped the batteries, and so they were not able to get power back to the reactor to continue cooling the reactor in time. So it was obviously a huge problem. They're still dealing with some of the impact, but it took a lot more than most people would ever imagine to get there.
Yeah.
And that's still a Gen 2 reactor with minor modifications. We're up to Gen 3 plus. That's our light water reactors, the SMRs that are being built by NuScale, GE, Holtec. Those are Gen 3 plus. Then we get to advanced reactors, which are some of the Gen 4s, which are X-Energy, TerraPower, Kairos, Flybe, and you're talking about reactors that are so inherently safe that it's almost hard to come up with a way there could be an accident.
Yeah.
With a molten salt reactor, it's not pressurized, so it won't blow up. If you have a meltdown, the salt drains out of the tank and then cools to ambient pressure. There is no such thing as, a core meltdown, because there is no core.
Yeah.
So the concern about nuclear safety, the perceived risk is dramatically higher than the actual risk. And as we get into more advanced technologies, the actual risk goes down to almost zero.
Yeah.
But the perceived risk is still going to be very high. So that is the one risk that we're struggling the most with.
It's perceived risk.
Perceived risk.
Because it impacts political risk.
Yes.
Before we move on from Fukushima, I do just want to comment. One of my mentors was over there, actually. She's a nuclear safety engineer, and we were having lunch one day, and she told me when she was on the ground, they had these huge walls that acted as barriers for waves if there was a tsunami.
Yep.
Right? And they had done the calculations of how tall do they need to build these walls.
Yep.
And they literally had a line on the plant at the level that they should have built to. That they're like if the worst earthquake tsunami ever came in at the magnitude that it did, then they could have built it. They would have protected it.
Yeah.
Had they just built the walls a little taller, right? And they'd actually calculated it and had it, but they were like, no, this is tall enough. So that was just one anecdote. And the other thing is, the nuclear industry protects against radiation.
Yep.
But nobody died from radiation at Fukushima.
No.
There wasn't a single person. And you go watch the videos of the plant after the core melted down and hydrogen accumulated in the building and the roofs blow off. Mm-hmm. It's terrifying. And there was a release of radiation, but nobody was hurt from it.
Right.
Yeah. That's I don't think that's highlighted enough. And yes, about 2,000 people died from the evacuation, but they didn't have to be evacuated. There was no hazard.
Well, a lot more people died from the tsunami and the earthquake than from the evacuation.
20,000 people died.
That was a massive disaster.
Yeah.
There's no getting around that.
Yeah.
And a lot of people, when they think of Fukushima, they don't think about the tsunami. They think about the nuclear plant.
Right.
And the tsunami itself was absolutely devastating.
And so when I've done the math, even when I include the deaths from the evacuations, right, from the plant, so that's deaths from radiophobia, not from radiation.
Right.
Nuclear is still safest.
Yeah.
So some could make an argument that solar could be safer, or just a little shade safer, but yeah. So
it's hard to come up with the specific numbers on that, but yeah. So then let's get into your other two risks. So, because when you get into the cost risk and the regulatory risk, those are both tied with the perceived nuclear risk.
Yeah, great point.
So way back in the day, before 3 Mile Island, before 9/11, before Chernobyl, the cost to build a nuclear plant was still high, but not astronomical. as things have happened.
Well, it was one of the cheapest, actually, right? That you
Yeah.
look back at the data. They're building plants for less than $1 per watt in 2023 dollars.
So
They're
the-
doing it for like 80 cents a watt.
Right. The build out long term cost, absolutely. I mean, your upfront capital cost is still high because there's a lot of steel and
No, that's
cement.
1968 plants. If you go back and look at the actual cost, the estimated costs, like
Right.
they were below $1 a watt to build
Right.
in 2023 dollars.
Yeah. What I'm saying is, so yes, absolutely. The capital cost for the power output, that was great. But the long-term cost is really where, because we always operate on LCOE,
Right.
and so that takes into account the cost to operate, which is headcount, fuel, maintenance, all of that stuff. And yeah, they were still expensive, but they were much better than a lot of the other options. Then the regulators got involved, and they said, "Oh well, we're going to come up with a regulation to make sure that that doesn't happen again." And so then they build in regulation, and then the next thing happens. They build in more regulation. 9/11 happens. Now all of a sudden you have to have a small army protecting every reactor. So all of a sudden that's a much higher cost to operate. So the regulatory body has never actually decreased the cost of operating reactors.
Mhm.
And have they increased the safety? Incrementally, absolutely. Has it matched the increase in cost? Absolutely not.
Meaning the best metric I've seen for this is dollars invested per life year saved.
Right.
And safety improvements to increase safety at nuclear power plants is some of the worst investments that we can make
Right.
to save more lives.
Absolutely. Well, there is no real way to make this measurement, but that's part of why we want to reduce carbon, because we know that the more carbon there is, the worse the atmosphere is going to behave in the future, and the more lives are at risk, the more powerful storms are going to be, the worse droughts are going to be, the worse floods are going to be. So by reducing carbon, you're actually making the world a safer place, which is exactly what we want to do with nuclear. So if you're saying, hey, we're going to invest money to reduce carbon, then nuclear is the best way to do it. But my favorite example of the regulators going overboard is ALARA. So as low as reasonably achievable. What does reasonable mean for cost to reduce radiation? In Colorado, because we're at higher elevation, we have less atmosphere between us and space and the sun's radiation. Also, we're closer to granite, which has natural radiation. We have more radon, which is just a byproduct of where we live. Coloradans get a lot of radiation, a lot more radiation than say Floridians or, people from North Carolina. But that doesn't factor into ALARA. And the ALARA principle is, hey, we're going to reduce at almost any cost the radiation that rad workers get while working at the plant. But if you fly from your plant to Washington, D.C. to meet with the NRC, you're going to get a huge dose of radiation that you wouldn't have gotten had you just stayed where you are. And that isn't accounted for in ALARA. If you had to take your dosimeter with you when you were flying or when you were doing all these other activities, you realize that there's a lot more radioactivity you're going to get from day-to-day life than you are from working on a nuclear plant.
Yeah.
So the regulatory burden has significantly increased the cost to operate your plant with almost no benefit.
Yeah. So those two risks, regulatory and cost, to summarize, you'd say originate in radiophobia. And if we correct radiophobia and say it's not as dangerous, and we understand it, we understand radiation, how to protect against it, so let's scale back some of the regulations and make these plants cheaper to build.
Yeah, that's spot on. So if the regulatory burden were not so severe, you wouldn't have to overinvest. Your capital costs could come down, your O&M cost could come down, your levelized cost of electricity, the LCOE, would be significantly lower in the future. Because right now, when we're talking about high LCOEs, it's because you have a massive capital cost to build these things. And you have a longer term high O&M. But then,
Just more people.
yeah, more
I mean,
people.
a lot of that's the people in the plant.
The security force is a huge one,
Yeah.
right? Our plants have security force, I can't get into the specifics, but it's a lot of people.
Yeah.
And people doing jobs, that's expensive. Now, are they adding the value that you would want them to add for the cost? I think that's the question. And with advanced reactor design and with a more inherently safe and impenetrable design, you don't have to have that level of security.
Yeah.
Even after 9/11, where everyone was concerned about terrorists targeting nuclear plants, that was the big push for increased security. If you have an inherently safe design where you can't have some of those same incidents, you don't need that security force, because you're not going to have any threat of a plane running into your plant and causing a massive core meltdown. So like I said, if you don't have a core, you can't have a core meltdown.
Yeah.
So that'll take care of a big portion of the cost if the regulatory burden were lighter. And then also right now, with the high interest rates, the high overnight capital cost means that you're going to have to borrow a lot more. With the interest rates as high as they are, that's having a massive impact on the long-term cost of the plant.
Yeah.
If the
It's
DOD...
like 50 to 60% of the cost. It's just the
Oh,
interest
yeah.
that you're going to pay while you're building it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And then for the next 40 years,
Yeah.
right? If the DOE wanted to do a massive push to build new nuclear in the United States, they would provide low-interest guaranteed loans to anyone who wants to build. And that would be probably the biggest impact they could have.
The Loans Program Office is kind of doing that, right?
Yes and no.
Okay.
The intent is there. The actual execution is where I think the reason it has not been utilized is that trying to get where you need to go is a lot harder than it needs to be.
Okay. Okay, so it sounds like these problems exist. You're certainly aware of them. I'm sure I'm aware of them. I'm sure Xcel as an organization is aware of them. And I assume these come into play when thinking about when and if and how we could build new nuclear plants in Colorado. And I know you probably can't speak on behalf of Xcel, but would there be a chance that we might convert some of these coal plants to nuclear plants in Colorado?
I would really like to think so. That's certainly what we're looking into.
Yeah.
There are many benefits to converting existing coal plants to nuclear. The biggest being the continued existence of the community, right?
Yeah. We talk about just transition, right? We're about to mandate that we shut down these extraction facilities, extraction industries that have built entire towns and communities for decades.
Yeah.
And now we're coming in as a society and saying, nope, you're not allowed to do that anymore, as though it's like a drug deal happening that we're going to shut down,
Yeah.
and provide them no other jobs. I mean, wind and solar projects aren't going to be just to put in place of a coal mine, right?
It's not even close.
Yeah.
You're from Rangeley.
Yeah.
I'm from Steamboat. We know Northwest Colorado. For anyone else listening, there are 2 coal plants in Northwest Colorado. One of them in Craig. That coal plant and the mine and the revenue from the plant keep the entire town alive. The other is Hayden. Hayden power plant provides a lot of really high quality jobs for Hayden, and then it also provides a massive portion of the tax base to keep the schools open.
Yeah.
The Hayden power plant is a huge part of the community of Hayden. If we were to close those plants down without a viable way to replace that source of revenue and source of jobs for those communities, the communities are going to be devastated. And
Yeah.
it's bad, right?
Generally cease to exist as they exist now.
Oh yeah, they'll certainly, they won't exist in any way the way they do now.
Yeah.
They'll figure out what to do, but I
Yeah.
mean, it behooves us as citizens of the state to try and help other parts of the community.
Right.
And for Craig, for Hayden, especially Craig, there's very little else there.
Yeah.
So ideally, we'd be able to build a nuclear plant there, because with the closure of the plant itself and the mine, there's going to be a lot of good labor. The coal plant workers who work at the coal power plant, they have the exact same skills that you need to work on a nuclear plant.
Right.
Secondary is the same. A lot of the electrical skills that the workers there have are directly transferable to a nuclear worker. The only difference for a few people is the actual operators for the core itself. So that is something that we'd probably need to import or maybe train, but it's a small enough portion that you could save a community by building nuclear there.
Yeah. And I mean, you and I are biased, right? You said I'm from Rangeley, and you're from Steamboat. With these towns straddle Craig and Hayden, right? Craig and Hayden
Yeah.
are right in between
Sandwiched.
Rangeley. Yeah, sandwiched in between Rangeley and Steamboat, and so it's very close to home for us.
Yeah.
Being from there, and we're both engineers. We're technocrats. We think that any problem can be solved with technology generally.
Yeah.
Or I do at least. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but from what I know of you and getting to know you, so you share some of these opinions. What would be the process then to do this? I mean, it takes a long time to build a nuclear plant, right?
Absolutely. So both, like I mentioned earlier, all of the coal plants are going to be shut down by 2031.
Yeah, and it's 2023 now, right?
Yeah.
In spring of 2023. And what's going to happen?
So let's, best case scenario, the state tomorrow would say, hey, we want to build nuclear to replace the coal plants. We would go out, figure out which technology we wanted to build. We would start the site evaluations, we'd start the early site permitting, we'd do all the upfront work that you have to do to get your license, and then we would start construction within a few years. Now, if we timed it well, the down ramp from the coal plants would be caught before it got too low with ramping up for construction of the nuclear plants. There'd be a little bit of a valley in there, but we could figure out ways to make it work. And at the end of that process, in 10 years, we could possibly have nuclear plants operational. Now, I don't know how much to believe out of all of the prognostications about the time to build some of these plants, but TerraPower is building their Cameroon plant. They're supposed to have it up and running by 2031. That means that the construction will be complete in 2030. There will be testing, there will be all the stuff that you need to do, and then COD, commercial delivery, that'll be 2031. If we were to go a few years after that, we would be catching the curve on the coal plants going down with construction of the new plants just in time to save a lot of those jobs and actually keep the communities robust and healthy. There would also be an influx because we're doing construction. These are major construction projects.
Yeah.
So you'd have construction crews coming in. It'd be temporary, but that would probably help
It'd
maintain.
be a lot more people than building renewable projects.
Absolutely. Those
Yeah.
come in, relatively low number of people. They leave, and then your projects, I mean, if it's solar plant, it's people to wipe down the panels.
Yeah.
That's not a very high-paying job for these communities.
Scrape off snow on panels during the summer, right? Yeah. Or during the winter.
During the
Yeah,
winter.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the best way to save the communities that are going through the coal transition is to find other high-quality jobs that are similar skill sets to replace those coal jobs with, and that happens to be perfect for nuclear.
Yeah. But the time piece is interesting to me. You know, wind and solar generally, I mean, we can't do wind and solar overnight either, but
Right.
I think most people
It's a few years.
have a perception that it's faster, that you could
Yeah.
build these things faster. But back to the beginning of our conversation, it doesn't really solve the problem of having power when you need it.
Yeah,
Right?
and in reality, I mean, there's a queue to get for the transmission and the building and all of the stuff
Yeah.
on the front end
Grid
of
interconnects,
renewables.
right? Yeah.
Absolutely. In the ISOs, the MISO, SPP, these are the big grid operators for multi-regions, right? The queues are years long
Yeah.
to try and bring these new projects on. In Colorado, we don't have an ISO. We're part of an independent ISO that we sort of help run as Xcel Energy. But you still have to go through this entire upfront process to make sure that when we bring power onto the grid, it's the right place, it has the right timing, that we've had enough time and cost to do the upgrades we need to bring that power on. You don't have to do very much of that if you're going to build nuclear. If
Yeah.
you're going to build nuclear on an existing coal site, you can basically just do a swap out. Say, all right, 600 megawatts of coal, we're going to shut that down, we're going to bring back on 600 megawatts of nuclear. You don't have to go through the queue, you can just bypass that line and say, this makes it easy.
Yeah. So the permitting process might be longer, but the actual getting tied into the utility and going through some of the, we'll say,
Yeah.
operations of
The upfront permitting process is longer, the actual construction process is longer, but because of the queue waiting for the transmission and the approval, the actual delivery of the electrons from when you start to say, I'm going to do this, to when it's actually on the grid, they could be similar times.
Yeah. And you said if we started tomorrow, your estimate would be 10 years before we have a plant on. That's just, I mean,
Yeah.
this is probably maybe groupthink in the industry that it takes 10 years to build a nuclear power plant. And I think Vogel, depending on how you count it, was like 11 from...
Well, yeah, depending on how you count it. If you go back to 1990 when they started and said, hey, we're going to
They
build
had the
these
idea for it,
reactors.
yeah.
But when they actually said, okay, this is official, we've got the site permits submitted to the NRC, from when they broke ground, yeah, it wasn't that long.
Yeah.
And the Vogel plants are huge, right?
Yeah. They're
So-
bigger than what we need in Colorado.
Right.
Yeah.
So now we get back to the benefit of SMRs. So small modular reactor. Once you've done a few of these things, building the next one is easy because you already know how to build. So first of a kind, there are going to be challenges no matter what, which is why a lot of the companies are trying to build prototypes as fast as they can so they can get that learning in. The second one, it's going to go better than the first one, but there will still be hiccups. Same with the third after the second. By the time you get to number 5, you've ironed out a lot of the wrinkles, you've learned what you need to learn, and you should be able to dramatically increase your rate of building new reactors and reduce the time it takes to do that. So we call that nth of a kind. So the 12th reactor in a series should be much lower cost, much higher speed, much more reliability.
Yeah.
So that's what we need. What we need to do is go back in time 5 years, build the first prototype so that now we'd be on the 5th one and we'd be able to crank out that 5th reactor in much less than 10 years.
Right.
Obviously-
That's not where we're at.
Right.
Right.
I mean,
So-
yeah, this goes back to the old saying, the best time to plant a tree was 10 years ago. The second best time is today, right?
Yeah.
So that's where we are. We're today. If we want to actually build nuclear, we need to get going on it because it is a long process due to the regulatory environment. And, I mean, it is a complex construction project no matter what. Just
Yeah.
building a coal plant, that's a long process because it's a complex plant. Building a nuclear plant is very similar, slightly more complex only due to the nuclear island, the core.
So we know, or I know, that several communities in Colorado, Weld County and Craig, are very interested in building plants.
Absolutely.
What is the process for them? I mean, like if Weld County wanted to build a nuclear power plant, how could they do it? And that certainly that's different than Craig. So let's start with Craig actually. If
Yeah.
tomorrow they said, yeah, we want to actually convert and we think it's a great idea, like who makes that decision? What's the process?
There are multiple different ways that it could happen, but
Okay.
what they would need to do would be start with their local politicians and say, hey, we think this is a good idea. Get that elevated to the state level. Get the state behind them to say, hey, from a state legislative and PUC level, we think this is a good idea and it's something we want to do.
So it goes to the
Concurrently-
state legislators, and then they influence the Public Utility Commission, PUC.
Yep.
Okay.
Concurrently, Tri-State is a majority owner of Craig, right?
Tri-State's the utility.
Yep.
Yep.
Tri-State is utility. There are multiple owners of Craig Power Station. Xcel owns a portion, Pacificor owns a portion, Powder River Project, and then I think Platte River Authority, and then Tri-State. So 5 owners. The only one of those owners that has experience operating nuclear plants is Xcel. So we'd have to figure out how to get ownership issues ironed out. There'd be a lot of legal wrangling and cost recovery concerns, but we could hypothetically build and operate a reactor at Craig as Xcel. Now, obviously this is Kyle Frazer speaking instead of Representative Xcel Energy,
Right. Right.
but it's possible. And that would be one of the things that the community would need to work on concurrent with the regulatory process, the state regulatory process.
I see. So actually working with the owners and the utility that has the authority to generate power and sell it to the state, right?
Yep.
Yeah. You got to get them on board too.
Yep,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Okay. So yeah, I mean, Xcel's a current operator of nuclear. and you guys are involved with the carbon-free power project,
Yep.
right? Up in
Idaho.
So let's pivot to that. What is it? How'd you guys come about getting involved? What's the project working on? What's some of the technology? Yeah.
So the Carbon-Free Power Project is the company in Idaho that is building the nation's first commercial SMR. It's a NuScale Voyager 6-pack. UAMPS is the Utah Association of Municipal Power Suppliers. That is it's a group of munis and co-ops in the West. I would say Utah, but there are people from New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, I think even California, as part of UAMPS.
Right.
So UAMPS members said, hey, we want to build an SMR, carbon-free power. They partnered with NuScale, which is right now probably the farthest ahead SMR technology as of April 2023. And they decided they're going to build the first SMR on Idaho National Labs and then deliver electricity to the grid and then, the states, the munis and the co-ops.
Yeah.
Xcel became involved in 2021 when I think AMS reached out and said, hey, we're looking for someone with operating experience to help us create the operating plan for this reactor. So we partnered with UAMPS to create CFPP. They did that. We partnered with CFPP, NuScale, and we've started to work on what it's actually going to look like to create the procedures, come up with a lot of the ways to take our operating model or our management model and apply it to the reactor, how we're going to train operators, how we're going to actually get people to the site, because the location is farther away from Idaho Falls than a lot of the other facilities. So trying to figure out where people are going to live. And all of the different factors that go into building a plant. For the most part, Xcel is providing the operating expertise since we are expert operators. And then NuScale is providing the OEM, the manufacturing expertise. They've partnered with Fluor, who is an EPC, an engineering procurement and construction firm. And then Fluor has, subcontractors who do other aspects. But overall, we've come together and we're working on what's going to take to actually build the world's first commercial modern SMR.
Which is awesome. And I mean, it's a big project. To say
Yes.
Carbon-Free Power Project as a company, but it's really like a consortium of multiple utilities and project developers and engineering and construction firms, right?
Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot of people behind this project.
Yeah, and a lot of people want to see it succeed, and the DOE is very involved. The NRC is making sure that we're trying to keep up to speed on everything, dotting the I's, crossing the T's, giving the support that we need. So there are a lot of different parties trying to make this work.
Yeah. What's the estimated timeline for when that'll be commercial?
2031.
2031 now.
Yep.
Okay. Yeah. And the NuScale Voyager technology is awesome. Fascinating. And
Yeah.
they're doing more than just this project, right?
Yeah, they have projects in Romania. They have a lot of interest from all over the world. I don't know what I can share under the NDAs
Sure,
that
yeah,
I'm on,
yeah.
but everything that
There's
I've
a lot of
shared
public
so far
information.
is
People
commercial,
can, go
public
and-
information. So
Go and find it publicly.
Romania, there's interest from other European nations, there's interest in Asia, there's interest from a lot of other American utilities. So the design is, it's exactly what we were talking about. It's revolutionary in that you have multiple small reactors that you can modularize, reduce the cost for every next reactor that you build. And they've gone ultra small. A lot of the SMRs are in the hundreds of megawatts electric output for the entire reactor, whereas NuScale went really small and they said, all right, we're going to build a bunch of really small units, and together they're going to have a few hundred megawatts output. So if you get 6 units together, it's around 500 megawatts. So you can say, all right, well, the cost for each unit is going to be even smaller than building a 300 megawatt unit, and it'll be faster to get to the point of nth of a kind with a NuScale than it would be with a 300 megawatt plant.
Yeah.
The second part is that the cores themselves are in pools of water. So a lot of the issues that you have with a current reactor is that it's above grade and it's not sitting in a pool of water. So if you have a meltdown, you have to pump in external water. With the NuScale design, the thing is sitting in a pool of water. So if anything happens, you have cooling to the core because it's sitting in that coolant itself. Now, that coolant, the pool that it's sitting in, isn't part of the primary. It's just an immediate safety case for the actual reactor. So something bad happens, you have a massive leak. The water that's just in the pool around the core is going to continue to cool the core for a long time, to the point where it's completely walk-away safe.
Right.
In the Navy, when you have, let's say, a scram, right? There are immediate actions you have to take.
What is a scram?
Oh, a scram is it's an emergency shutdown of the reactor.
Okay.
It actually stands for Supercritical Reactor Axeman. It's back in the day, and this is, I've heard this enough that there's some validity to it. There was a guy with an axe who would cut the rope, and that would drop the control rods down.
That was like Chicago Pile 1, right? Like going back to that, I think there was that was their safety system.
I mean, it was the same sort of system.
Yeah.
I think the actual word scram came from Idaho National Labs with some of the tests, but yes, so it was a guy who inserted rods manually. Right. So when you scram a modern reactor, it's usually a combination of gravity and springs and jamming those rods into the core. But on a submarine, when you scram the reactor, you have immediate actions that you need to take to keep the submarine safe, mostly. But in a modern nuclear plant, if there's a scram, there are other things you need to do, right? You're going to have a bunch of extra hot water. You're going to need to make sure that you're going to continue circulating water because the plant is now in a state that it's not used to being in, right? In a lot of the advanced reactor designs, all your immediate actions are do nothing. Sit on your hands. If the reactor scrams, you sit back. You don't touch anything. You say, okay, I'm going to let this thing go through its process because a lot of the safety is engineered into the actual design.
Right.
And that's exactly where we want to be with these advanced designs. Gen 1 required a lot of manual intervention to keep the reactor safe. Gen 2, a little bit less, but still quite a bit. Gen 3, where we are now, you can shut down the reactor fairly safely. There are a few things that we want to do, but for the most part, you don't have to do anything too crazy, and the reactor is going to be safe. Gen 4, there's nothing to do. You sit back and you say, okay,
meaning the AP1000, right?
The AP1000. Yeah. Well, I think the AP1000 is technically a Gen 3 plus.
Okay.
But yeah, when we get into the Gen 4s, there is nothing. And the NuScale is also a Gen 3 plus, but they're to the point where there are no immediate actions. Do nothing is what you need to do.
Yeah.
So if something bad happens, sit on your hands, do nothing.
So the NuScale project's awesome, carbon-free power project. You mentioned the TerraPower project in Wyoming, and I know that you're apprised of generally all the technologies and vendors. Is there a system that perhaps is, and not to demonstrate Xcel's bias, but just like Kyle Frazer's perception, and maybe the right way to ask this is, what are some of the characteristics about systems that you like more than others, and which would be potentially most useful or easy to deploy in Colorado?
Yeah, so that's, and again, this
maybe a big question. Yeah,
this is Kyle Frazer's opinion, not Xcel's official opinion. Yeah. I really like the molten salt reactors. The molten salt reactors, from a physics standpoint, they are inherently a better design. So if you were to create a matrix of enthalpy versus pressure, you want low pressure because the more pressure you have, the more likely things are to explosively release, right? Yep. So that is why current reactors are problematic with water, because when you heat water, if you keep the pressure the same, it won't boil. If you reduce the pressure at the higher temperature, it will immediately boil, which is the explosive release of energy.
Right.
So all of the pressurized water reactors, it's right there in the name, they're under very high pressure. If you were to release that pressure, go to atmospheric, all of that water boils away, right? So low pressure is great. Now, water's bad for that.
Yeah.
Water also...
Water boils, right?
Yeah, water boils, right? There are liquid metals, right? Liquid metals you can have at low pressure. So that immediately leads you in that direction. But now you get into enthalpy. So enthalpy is the ability of a material to conduct and hold heat, right? That's not the scientific definition, and I'm sure my physics teacher from 20 years ago would probably be slapping my hands. But if you go to the enthalpy of some of the materials, the metal's not as good as molten salts. So you get to molten salts, and they're low pressure, high enthalpy. That's the ideal state that you want. So there are a few molten salt designs out there that are great. I don't think that any of them are bad. I think there are better of those. My personal favorite is FLIBE. We can burn thorium, which is much more plentiful than uranium on the Earth. It's low pressure. They have a few other design elements that are already built in there that, I think everyone should learn about FLIBE on their own because they're an awesome company, but they have a lot of really cool stuff in there. And also we've run the same sort of reactor in the United States. Alvin Weinberg loved the design of a liquid fluoride thorium reactor, right?
Yeah.
He's one of the nuclear pioneers. He loved this design because it was simple, it was easy, and it had a lot of potential. This was in the 60s and 70s. We ran one for years down at Oak Ridge.
Yeah.
So the United States was the leader in liquid sodium and liquid fluoride and liquid salt reactors for years and years and years. And then we stepped away from it and went over only to water. So now we're actually behind.
Which is really peculiar to me, coming from an oil and gas background where we test everything. Yeah, and I understand how groupthink works and standardization, and there's a lot of merit to that. But yeah, moving away from kind of...
Well, at the time, part of the reason that molten salt reactors, especially thorium reactors, were not popular is that you can't turn them into weapons-grade material.
Right.
So at the time, most of the reactor research was to create weapons. So Teller, who took over a lot of the nuclear project after the Manhattan Project, there was Teller. He was the one who promoted the hydrogen bomb. He said, I don't need a reactor unless it's going to make weapons-grade fissile material. If you have a reactor that's not making me fissile material, I don't want it. And that was the molten salt reactors and the thorium reactors. There's just too much work to create fissile material out of this. So the funding was pulled, and we went with the other reactors.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But FLIBE's not the only one. There's Kairos, right?
Yeah, there's
and
Kairos.
TerraPower, part of their design utilizes salts, right? The natrium.
So the natrium, it's liquid metal, but their storage, their secondary.
Their thermal battery.
Yeah, that is a salt. Then there's terrestrial, which is also salt.
Right.
And then there's some of the micros that use salt, but I don't know much about the micros because we're staying away from those. But yeah, Kairos, I love the stuff that they're doing. Their vertical integration model is spectacular. I like what they're doing. And they're in our service territory. We're trying to work with them to figure out if we can make something happen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That'd be awesome. Okay, so we're coming up on our time, Kyle. This has been awesome. I've just got a couple more questions for you. So,
all right,
we'll
race through them.
If we had to deploy nuclear tomorrow, how do we do it? I know we talked generally kind of
how would we do it?
Maybe what are the number one or two things that we could do or improve on or take action on that could help nuclear get built?
The biggest thing is to educate people so there's less fear about nuclear. That's it.
Education.
From that, everything else is a domino, right? Now, if we get down to the second level, we can reduce the regulatory burden. We can promote some more dollars going into research to get more prototypes built. We can have a little bit more support for individual companies that need that support to actually start doing some more of the science, right? INL, they have a lot of support. They're doing a huge amount of work, but that's mostly INL. There are many national labs that are doing a lot of individual work projects. We could bring all that together and go after an effort a little bit more cohesively, and that would probably help the entire industry.
Yeah, nice. The other question I had was, how can we make it more investable? But I think if we educate people and then we perhaps peel back some of the regulations, that would help a lot. But is there anything else that comes to mind?
It depends on what sort of investment you're thinking about. If we're talking about someone who's trying to get payback in 3 to 5 years, that's not likely with nuclear.
At the scale that we're thinking, for utility scale.
Right, for utility scale. I mean, you could say, hey,
I think there's some microreactors that are going to get payback in that amount of time. But
there might be.
Yeah.
Well, if they start with a huge pile of DOD funding to get them to where they need on the maturity level, then probably. But nuclear can do medical isotopes. There are companies out there that are doing medical isotopes. That's a revenue stream, so you could invest, get a prototype built. Instead of using that to reduce power, you could produce medical isotopes and then use the research from the prototype to then help get your license and help accelerate the entire program. You could also figure out, and I think a lot of large investors are doing this, not only in the United States but in the world, there is a very evident lack of generation coming onto the grid. And people are saying, all right, this isn't a short-term investment, this is long-term investment. I know in 20 years there will need to be a lot more nuclear power. So they're making long-term bets, right?
Yeah. And those kind of need to come from the state level, right?
Right now it's coming from individual philanthropists. Bill Gates, Warren Buffett. That's where TerraPower is getting their funding. So Bill Gates said, I'm going to invest a lot of money to make sure that we have sustainable, carbon-free generation in the long run. And that's where TerraPower is getting its funding.
Okay, so leave us on an optimistic note, Kyle. Where do you see all this going? 2033, what's the world going to look like?
2033, there will be new nuclear operating. There will be a lot of new nuclear being built in the construction phase. And there will be enough technology advance and enough extra effort put into this that it won't even be a scary conversation anymore. It'll be a normal part of planning for future cities. Oh, are we going to site an SMR near this new development to provide power for this community so that we don't have to build excessive transmission? There will be micro reactors operating in places like Puerto Rico and Alaska and places where you want a reliable source of power that doesn't have to be shipped in or isn't susceptible to hurricanes or is a little bit of a safer battery solution. What else will happen? The cost of electricity will have gone up, and that makes it such that nuclear will be a lot more competitive. By investing early in nuclear, the long-term cost will then go back down. But to get there, we have to deal with some of the pain up front.
I see. What's going to drive electricity cost up?
Right now, the cost is we're shutting down coal. To replace that, as we talked about earlier, you have to build batteries, then you have to overbuild the generation side. That's going to drive up the cost of electricity.
Yeah.
We're not going to be able to build nuclear in time and get it to the nth generation in time to start bringing the cost back down. So the cost will go up over the next 10 years.
Yeah.
By the time we've started to get nuclear on a smooth runway where the costs are going to start come down, the costs will already be up.
Yeah.
So it's inevitable.
But more nuclear being built everywhere, which would be good long term.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great.
That's
Kyle, this has been great. Really appreciate it, man.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Cool. Thanks. Great to talk to you.
Thank you.